you remember Ron Jones, my former student? He's in Cambodia.
Yeah, I know.
And he said he sent the link to all the fishery people in entire country, something like 130 people.
Yeah.
So if you get an unusual
number
Cambodian contingent,
yeah, that will be on the YouTube. Yeah,
surprised.
Yeah, we'll know who is there, and we'll see. Yeah. Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, because we know people are joining us from different parts of the world. My name is Prateep Nayak, and I am at the University of Waterloo. I'm also representing here the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership for Small-Scale Fisheries, and I will be the host today for the webinar talk. Thank you for joining us. I would do a few rounds of introduction. First, I will introduce the partnership that many of us are part of. I will introduce the thematic webinar series that has brought all of us together today. And then I will introduce briefly our speaker today before we start, listening to the talk from Dr. Fikret Berkes. So the first about the B2B Global Partnership, which is a transdisciplinary research, knowledge, and action network with over 100 members from Asia, Africa, Canada, and internationally. The goal of the partnership is to support small-scale fisheries in their transition from vulnerability to viability. And the way we understand vulnerability and viability terms are not just in an economic sense, but also to include cultural, ecological, and political and economic aspects of small-scale fishers' life. Our focus in this particular partnership is to co-create and co-produce knowledge, create a repository in the form of an information system, developing multi-level transdisciplinary capacity in small-scale fisheries, and also create synthesis and integration of the knowledge for governance of small-scale fisheries. And hopefully all of that would lead to viability of small-scale fisheries in the transition from vulnerability to viability. The Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership aims to identify the diverse factors and conditions contributing to the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries and engage collaboratively with SSF communities and other key NGO, government, and university partners to enhance small-scale fisheries viability. We are conducting transdisciplinary community-engaged research in 6 countries in Asia, which includes Bangladesh, India, Indonesia, Japan, Malaysia, Thailand, and 6 countries in Africa that includes Ghana, Malawi, Nigeria, Senegal, South Africa, and Tanzania. In doing so, the Vulnerability to Viability Global Partnership brings people and organizations together across physical, cultural, and disciplinary boundaries through a shared interest in addressing global change impacts on small-scale fisheries. The V2V thematic webinar series for which we have gathered here today is an initiative of the V2V Global Partnership to facilitate and generate high-level discussions on vulnerability and viability themes and topics within the context of small-scale fisheries. The goal here is to feature academics, government representatives, practitioners, and members of the civil society who have made significant contributions to the theoretical, practical, and policy aspects of small-scale fisheries, both locally and globally. B2B thematic webinar series takes place on the last Friday of every month, and it will be so throughout 2022. The series is available internationally through live streaming on YouTube. Details regarding the monthly webinars, including speakers, topics, and titles, and links to webinar platform is available to our through our website at www.v2vglobalpartnership.org. Today's webinar is the 4th in the series of V2V thematic webinars planned for the year 2022, and the 16th since January 2021 when we actually started. And it is my privilege to introduce Dr. Fikret Berkes as our distinguished speaker today. Dr. Berkes is a Distinguished Professor Emeritus at the University of Manitoba, Canada. Before his retirement, he held a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair in Community-Based Resource Management from 2002 to 2016. Dr. Berkes works on theoretical and practical aspects of community-based management, commons, local and traditional knowledge, and social-ecological resilience. He is currently an active member of the V2B Global Partnership in his capacity as a co-investigator and advisor. An applied ecologist by training, Dr. Berkes is intellectually admired for his groundbreaking contributions to the human or people sciences and/or interdisciplinary social sciences. His decades of tireless scholarly work has taught us the importance of skillfully dismantling the artificial boundaries between theories, concepts, knowledge systems, and geographies if the goal is to achieve sustainability. And for that matter, resilience, well-being, empowerment, justice, and above all, social-ecological viability. In doing so, he combines social and ecological perspectives for the study of relations between society and their resources. He is particularly interested in community-based small-scale fisheries and fishing communities and has worked in numerous countries in the Americas, Asia, and Africa. He has authored over 250 peer-reviewed journal articles, chapters, including 13 books. His recent books include Toward a New Social Contract, TBTI 2021, Sacred Ecology, Routledge 2018, Governing Coastal Commons with Armitage and Charles, Routledge 2017, and Coasts for People, Routledge 2015, and several others. An influential scholar who has close to 90,000 Google Scholar citations, and a finest human being with down-to-earth personality and full of empathy, Fikret has positively influenced the lives of many, that certainly includes myself, and continues to do so tirelessly. What a privilege I have to be introducing him today. I can just go on endlessly talking about Fikret, but I must end so that we can listen to Dr. Berkes today. So it is my honor to invite Dr. Fikret Berkes to deliver today's talk for the V2B thematic webinar series 2022. And the title of his talk today is Getting to Viability from Vulnerability, Where Does Resilience Come In? Fikret, over to you, please.
Thank you, Prateep. That's much too generous an introduction. I hope I can live to it in about 40 to 45 minutes, but that's going to be hard. I am a charter member of V2V. Our discussion about V2V, in fact, goes back before there was a project. We write papers together, Prateep and I. Today, I'm coming to you from Winnipeg, which is in central Canada, one time zone away from Prateep, Seville, and their team. And we can start from there. Somehow the slide doesn't move. Okay, so the webinar is about viability, and there are many aspects, many phases of getting to viability. The vulnerability term in the approach in the project signals a vulnerability approach, which means identifying vulnerabilities and trying to reduce them. But of course, vulnerabilities are not stationary. They're not constant. They change, and in particular, with small-scale fisheries, as practitioners, scholars, or fishers yourselves, you know there are always new shocks, different shocks, and these could be environmental changes like climate change. Now we're hearing about Southern Africa, huge impacts of climate change, increased cyclones, hurricanes, we call them in North Atlantic. We can have changes in markets, regulations, marine protected areas, and of course, blue economy policies. We get to that in a few moments. So all small-scale fisheries are constantly facing changes. These are unpredictable changes to large extent, and that takes us to resilience. Of course, small-scale fisheries are very varied, and the kinds of shocks they face are also very varied. I'm going to give you a brief sketch of 4 different fisheries, clockwise, starting from the top left. This is in Canada, northern British Columbia, Pacific coast. This is a small and medium-sized fishery. Well, these are fairly large-looking boats, some of them, but it's still a medium-sized fishery in that it's an inshore fishery. This fishery suffers from the impact of large offshore trawlers and large gill netters. So there's an interception fishery for the same stocks that this fishery relies on, which is salmon. So by the time all these other fleets hit the salmon stocks, there's almost nothing left for the inshore fishery. And to a large extent, when I was visiting this place, their boats were tied up. The second picture, the nice-looking cove is in Brazil. You see a mix of small-scale fishing boats and pleasure boats. These two sectors get along well because fishers in the off-season rent their boats for pleasure boaters. What you don't see in the picture are the impacts. One impact is the trawlers that come into that area, somewhat illegally, but they do come. Across on the mainland, where you see the hills, there's a nuclear plant, and that's a constant threat. And then behind me, the photographer, there's offshore oil development, which hasn't really started in full, but it's going to have a big impact. So the peaceful small-scale fisheries is facing all these challenges. The third picture with all the fish in it is Bangladesh. They have a very different problem. They have lots of resource, but of course this is Bangladesh, so they also have a lot of mouths to feed. Their problem is basically access and control. They do have access. The government rents out fishing spots. It's a continuation of a colonial system called the Zamindari system. So the rich people buy the fishing spots, they sublet it to smaller, and those sublet it to another smaller. And finally, the smallest subletter lets the fishermen fish, but then collects the resource rent. So by the time these fishers catch the fish, most of the resource rent is gone. So they make very little money. In fact, Bangladesh is famous for fishermen always owing money to these controllers, fishing spot controllers and money lenders. The last photo is India, southern India, Kerala, Cochin area. This is an estuary. It's a lucrative fishery. It's a bag net fishery for shrimp. There's a good market. There's a good resource. These fishers are well organized. They're part of a co-op, a sangam. But there are lots of other fishers who are also fishing there who are not part of the self-regulated fishery. But the worst part is that these fishermen are not legally fishers. They do not have licenses, but they are traditional fishers by caste. And the cases in front of the courts in India, court cases often favor fishermen, but they take a very, very long time and, and rarely they're resolved in favor of small-scale fishers. So that gives you at least my perspective of how different these small-scale fisheries can be and the kind of issues they face. My plan here, I'm going to talk about resilience, of course. I'm going to do some basics. We're going to talk about coping, adapting, transforming, a little bit of theory. And the second part of the seminar is about community resilience. We talk about key points like institutions, social learning, fisher knowledge. and then we talk about some of the threats. And then I end up with the role of researchers and practitioners in participatory research and other ways of helping small-scale fisheries. In brief, resilience is the capacity to deal with change. There are several theories that talk about change. And in my view, resilience is probably the best approach in dealing with change. And we talk about resilience as a capacity. It's not something that's tangible, but it's a capability. It's a capacity to do something. Resilient systems, by definition, have the following abilities, have the following capabilities. Resilient systems can absorb shocks, and by that I mean short-term changes and stresses, and that refers to longer-term stretches like that nuclear plant in Brazil. Resilient systems self-organize, as in being able to organize co-ops. And resilient systems can learn from experience, and they can adapt using that learning. So a resilient fishery then has the ability to respond to shocks and stresses while still retaining its identity as a fishery system. But very important here, resilience also means this ability to respond in a way that leaves the system better prepared for future impacts of change. And we're talking about the system now. The system we define as a social ecological system. A fishery is a social ecological system. It's not just the fish, it's not just the fishermen, but the two together. So technically, it's a complex adaptive system. And the two sides are the social. And this is a nested system, meaning small community, region, national level. And then you have the ecosystem, which can be the estuary and the inland sea and the open sea. So social ecological system is multi-level, it's nested. The two parts are coupled, they're interdependent through relationships, institutions, knowledge, and the two are co-evolutionary. When one changes, it leads to change in the other one. And if things are working, it leads to mutual and reciprocal well-being. In other words, the viability of the system, the viability of the fisher and the community depends on the viability of the stock. And conversely, the viability of the stock, okay, how does it work? Viability of one is important for the other, and the reverse as well. So we use the social ecological system as a unit of analysis when we're using resilience. Two illustrations. The photo on the left is a halibut fishery, northern British Columbia, Pacific Canada. What's in the SES here? Well, the SES involves boats like the ones I showed you in the first picture, and the fishermen who catch these halibut, they bring it home and they process the halibut. It's a large fish, and you can see the fisher making very thin fillets of this fish. They make thin fillets because they dry it, and they dry it because this is food they keep. This is not food they sell. This is food they keep over the winter. So the fishery social ecological system does include the processor as well as the fish, as well as the fisher themselves. We don't know if this person did actually catch the fish, but we do know he's doing the processing. The other picture is from Cambodia, just to emphasize that the fishery social ecological system is not only the crabs and the fish they're catching, but also the processing. The women do the processing. The crab is probably a swimming blue crab, Calanectes. Of course, it's not blue once you cook it, but it's the women who get the meat out of this crab for commercial sale, and then they also do the cooking, and that's in fact what she's doing. So the social ecological system in many cases also include women's work. In fact, almost all cases. Now you're going to say, well, are vulnerability and resilience related? Well, they sure are, but how is the question. If the fishery is adapting to or coping with changes, that's obvious enough. Less obvious is that uncertainties cannot be eliminated, whether uncertainties in vulnerability or uncertainties in other things, they cannot be eliminated. So you need to build resilience. You need to build the ability to cope and adapt. And that is a very logical way to go about it. If you have all these vulnerability factors that keep coming up. So the relationship between vulnerability and resilience is real, but it's not simple. Some people think vulnerability and resilience are the flip sides of one another, reverse of one another. That's not right. That's not true. The two concepts actually come from two very different fields. Vulnerability comes from human geography. It has its own theory, practice, and resilience comes from ecology originally. And so these are two very different fields with differences, key differences in assumptions, in methodology and practice. Well, nobody likes definitions, but in this case, it's important. Resilience is defined as the capacity of a system to absorb disturbance and reorganize. So resilience doesn't assume there's no change. It assumes there is always change. But what you want is not eliminate change, but rather you want the system to absorb disturbance and still retain the same function, structure, identity, feedbacks in that system. So I put this definition up because resilience is not bouncing back to the original state. It is not bouncing back because there is no original state to bounce back to. It's always changing. As the wisdom from earlier civilizations tell us, you can't step into the same river twice. So resilience, if it's not about bouncing back, what is it about? It's about flexibility and keeping options open when you're facing change. So it's forward-looking, and it's a way to respond to uncertainty and unpredictable change. These two terms are, I'm using them synonymously, but there's some, I'm sure the experts have some subtle differences between them. So the emphasis then in resilience is the ability of the system, the capacity of the system to deal with a perturbation, coping, adapting, transforming. This is what it looks like. Christophe Bene and Kate Brown are using this, and I'm using it as well. It's a bit different from the original Holding Resilience, which focused on adaptive capacity. But this thinking with Bene and Brown and others is that we think resilience includes all three. The absorptive capacity, which is about stability, coping capacity, persistence, as well as this adaptive capacity, and then the transformative capacity, because sometimes you cannot, coping and adapting is not sufficient, and you have to transform. You have to, the whole system changes, and that's the ability to transform from a fishery, small-scale fishery, into something else, maybe aquaculture, maybe something else, tourism. We have cases of each of those in that book that Prateep mentioned with Tony Charles, with Derek Armitage, Tony Charles, and myself. Now, the original Buzz Hauling on resilience was about complexity and system dynamics. Hauling is the guy who looks at dynamics, the changes. He hates when people make assumptions that things are constant, things are stable. That he keeps pointing out that he died a few years ago, but this was his big thing. So initially, he talked about ecological systems. The classical paper dates back to 1973. But over the last 2 decades, resilience has been about the social ecological system. So we've managed to put humans into the resilience analysis. But it's still a systems concept, which some social scientists don't like, but that's what it is. And systems concept means you need to look at complex system characteristics like self-organization, scale, unpredictability, non-linearity. You know, they say the butterfly effect, where a small change causes a big change in the outcome. A small change in the environment causes a big change in the outcome. Deals with drivers, disturbance events, system memory. Tipping points become very important, thresholds. So I'm going to do a little bit of theory on that using ball and socket diagrams. A stable, resilient system, by definition, can cope with shocks and disturbances. And the ball stays in the socket, doesn't get to the threshold. So that's a resilient system. And the current state is maintained through coping and adapting. But in an unstable system, a disturbance is pushing the ball right out of the socket to the threshold and into a different stability domain, into an alternative state. So this is the threshold. And this is the ball in the resilient system. Notice the ball is not stationary. The ball is always moving, but it's moving within that socket, which stands for the system health. Now, what happens when you have a change in the system? And here we're talking about environmental changes like climate change, but also social changes like policies and prices and urbanization and so on. Here the deep socket symbolizes a highly resilient system. The ball is still moving, but it's in a highly stable area, and it doesn't get near the threshold. But when you have changes occurring in the system, the changes erode resilience. So the deep pocket, the deep socket becomes increasingly shallower. In other words, changes make the system less resilient, so the ball can get to the threshold and roll into a new system state. A sip of my Brazilian coffee. It's still early morning in Winnipeg, so the example I give you is from Chilika. So if you have any questions, you can direct them to Prateep, because it's Prateep's big case study from coastal area. Chilika Lagoon is Prateep will tell you that it's the biggest lagoon in all of Asia. It's Bay of Bengal, India. There's a long-standing small-scale fishery. These are traditional fishers, caste-based fishers. The fishers and their families, it's a big population, about 500,000 people, 400,000 people. But the small-scale fishery is at the threshold of being tipped into a different system, aquaculture. Aquaculture started when shrimp, international markets for shrimp became very lucrative. So the big investors moved in. These are not traditional fishers. They're definitely not caste-based fishers. They're investors. So they've been pushing gradually this small-scale fishery out of the way because a lagoon is protected waters, it's shallow, it's just perfect for aquaculture. We've been concerned about resilience in the system, but whose resilience? We're not concerned about the resilience of the aquaculture investors. We're concerned about the resilience of the small-scale fishery. So it becomes important. Resilience is not value-free. You have to ask the question, whose resilience? Just pointing out that the photo on the left, these are women's self-help groups. So the women are part of the system. They are trading dry fish. They're measuring the amount of dry fish. And the women are also taking part in the social protests against the photo on the left, against the takeover by aquaculture. Women are politically active, and politics of small-scale fisheries versus something else is, well, it involves political action, and it's a good photo. All Prateep's photos, it captures that spirit, protests, etc. Okay, so how do we enhance resilience when we say whose resilience? We're talking about small-scale fisheries. So what do we do about it? There's a long list of things. This list is mostly from ORCID Biggs and her group. I can't go through them all. It's a very long list, and it's only one of maybe 4 or 5 lists that I know of. It's in the annual review of environment and resources. I'm going to talk about 2 of these. The first 2 in bold with examples. So we're applying the principle of maintaining diversity and redundancy as a way of strengthening resilience. The first example is from Cambodia, Koh Sralao. It's an estuary and a coast near the Thai border. It's based on the PhD work of Melissa Marshke. So we were in the field, and we noticed that the fishery was based mainly on 2 resources. And the fishery used mainly 2 different kinds of gears for these 2 resources. But the fishermen in the community, the fishers in the community, was a mix of traditional fishers versus immigrant fishers. Immigrant fishers moved there some years ago because of the civil war in Cambodia, which really horrible, the killing fields and all that. The movie was called Killing Fields, in case you have come across. You couldn't see the difference between these 2 groups of fishers unless you visited them and went to see their gear sheds. The traditional fishers, remember, they're only using 2 different kinds of gears, but typically they had 8 to 9 different kinds of gears. So they were well positioned to move on to some other resource if the 2 existing resources did not work, were depleted, or something happened. The immigrant fishers were simply copying the old fishers, the traditional fishers, but they had no backup. They had no additional gears. They only had the 2 gears they were using. They didn't have the other gears. They didn't know how to use the other gears. They didn't know how to approach other fisheries. So there was this resilience, this keeping options open in the traditional fishers, but unless you went to see what they were actually doing and what options they had, you couldn't tell the difference between the 2 groups. So diversity and redundancy. The second example is from Indonesia, Bali, the village of Les. Village of Les is interesting because this was the first village that actually took measures to stop cyanide fishing in coral reefs. The cyanide use, which is a poison, of course, was used by people who caught ornamental fish for sale to saltwater aquariums. When you use cyanide, it sort of makes these ornamental fish easy to catch, but it also kills the coral reef. And when you kill the coral reef, you damage the inshore fishery, because the coral reef is important as a nursery area for a lot of fish. So the fishers combined their knowledge together with scientific knowledge that came through the NGOs, that in fact you are killing the coral reef, because it doesn't happen immediately, it happens through a period of time. And by combining the different kinds of knowledge, their knowledge plus scientific knowledge, the fishers learned that cyanide has to be eliminated because it destroys the habitat. And they actually did that through their local institutions, although some of the other communities have done it incompletely, but this one was in this one community, which is a large community with a large area, they actually did a good job. Okay, so that's an example of combining different kinds of knowledge for learning, social learning. That is one of the ways to build resilience. So that takes us to community resilience. Photo from Tony Charles, whom you had in January, I think. It's a Nova Scotia fishing community. These are lovely areas. So we're applying resilience ideas. Same idea here. Community resilience means basically the capacity to cope, adapt, transform. And the idea is to maintain the overall function and structure of the fishery. And in some of Tony Charles's areas, in fact, there is aquaculture coming into the bay and displacing the small-scale fishery, and we have publications on that. So the questions we ask: how is the community coping with change? Does the community have flexibility and options to adapt to these changes? And if they have to, do they have the capacity to transform into something else that's still viable, but maybe not the original fishery? When we look at community resilience, a bunch of other factors pop up. We did a paper with Helen Ross, and the factors here are mainly from studies in Australia on community resilience. And there's a different set of factors here than the big list I gave you. First of all, there's an emphasis on agency, the ability of people and institutions to influence things. Other factors are similar, like knowledge and learning, but leadership becomes important in community resilience. People-place relationships, sense of place becomes really important. And then there are some factors that are nowhere near what Buzz Holling had in mind originally, like community infrastructure and diverse and innovative economy. I mean, diverse economy turns out very important for communities. Infrastructure, biologists say, well, how can we help this fishery? And the fishers say, well, we need a road connection. We need a harbor where we can land our fish. Okay, so that's infrastructure. And that's not so obvious if you just look at the ecology, but it becomes really important if you look at what fishers really need, which is social, economic, as well as ecological. The key points, institutions. First, you need institutions like local co-op, fishers associations, and then you need linkages between that local institution with regional and national level institutions. So institution building is a big area and a difficult area. You need these connections because it's a multi-level system. You can't solve problems simply at the local level. You've got to go regional, you've got to go national. So the successful fishery institutions are those that are, first of all, strong locally, but also have these connections, these linkages with other levels. Social learning and social memory, in part related to the linkages, because what the fisher observes at the local level has to move up to influence policy at the higher level. The fishers may have perfect solutions to problems, but if they cannot convince government to change regulations, for example, then it's useless. So you need that social learning in addition to the institutional linkages. The social memory refers to the ability to remember what happened the last time. I know a case in Barbados where they started getting bleaching events through climate change. And initially, the fishers had no idea on what to do next or how fast the system would recover. It did recover, but they had to go to fishermen and they had to go to retired fishery biologists to find out what happened the last time. And that's social memory. And also important, adaptive management, which is learning by doing. And here's some jargon here. You need networks of actors sharing management responsibility to make adaptive management work. Again, you need the institutions, you need the learning, and then you can do that phenomenon, that learning by doing. And this is really important in a changing environment like climate change, because it's a moving target. So you can't have one solution. You have to see what the last solution was and how it worked or how it not worked, and then you build on it. So we come to fisher knowledge and knowledge co-production. This is adapted from Maria Tengo and her colleagues in Sweden. Bridging knowledge. Okay, so these are different strands of knowledge. Local knowledge 1, indigenous knowledge 1, local knowledge 2, transdisciplinary knowledge, social science knowledge, natural science knowledge. You notice that they rarely join up, but you use them instead in parallel to bridge this knowledge and enrich knowledge for better insights. And co-produce knowledge, which we define with Derek Armitage and colleagues as combining different kinds of knowledge to increase the range of information available to understand the problem and make informed decisions. Well, those are the solutions, or those are the approaches, but we do have to worry about threats to community resilience, and there are many, especially with the recent emphasis on the blue economy. Recent paper by Farmery, Allison, Andrew, you heard from, I think last month, was it, Seville? It came out in One Earth, and the graphics are from the same publication. The authors say the emphasis on increasing profitable things is a real risk that undermines ocean's contribution to SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, and they identify goals number 1, 2, 13, and 14. So what's the vision of this blue economy? Well, large fisheries, jumping whales, this is the wrong species, by the way, wind farms, oil drilling, more drilling ships, container vessels, big trade, big tourism, marine protected areas. A lot of things happening here. Do you see any small-scale fisheries? Not very much. It's in this little corner here. While the blue is mass-produced fish in frozen containers, the local small-scale fishery is selling a couple of fish here with a little table and a couple of people. If you look at the previous picture, they're there, but they're down here, very marginalized. So this I think is the real threat, marginalizing small-scale fisheries within this big money economy. That's pretty scary. So the overall issue for your viability, that's a big one. When you look at that vision of this blue economy, I'm not sure how to tackle that. It's not going to be done by point vulnerability, point by point resilience. It's a big issue. What do we need? We need recognition of small-scale fishery rights, blue justice, as TBTI calls it. Read up on Sven Jentof's work. I think he's a leading voice in that. Need access to resources, access to markets. You can, I'm sure most of you know about the SSF guidelines from FAO. That's the Bible. We've been calling it Bible. So that's the big picture. Now, I'm beginning to run out of time. So what can researchers do? Well, there are several methods of applied research that can help build community resilience. Some of them were designed for community resilience, some of them designed for other things, but applicable to community resilience. Development, obviously, as in international development, community-based planning. These are things that Helen Ross does in Australia. Participatory rural appraisal. Many of these techniques came out of agriculture, including PRA, this is PIA, participatory rural appraisal. I'm going to focus on participatory methods, participatory research and applications. Now, I emphasize this because this is about building resilience by helping communities increase their own understanding of change through research, reflection, and applied learning. So the argument I make here is that it's not sufficient for us as researchers and practitioners to understand change. We also need to help communities increase their own understanding of change. And I'm going to give you briefly 3 examples. One is about participatory research, one is capacity development, and one is scenario planning. This is the work of my Uruguayan PhD student, Michaela Trimble. Uruguay is this tiny country here. Argentina has offshore fleets and they cut off these fishers, a bit like the British Columbia case. These are small 8 to 10 meter boats, maybe 12 at most. So they face competition from large-scale fisheries, sure, but they also face competition from cheap imports, like 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 uh, like aquaculture fish from Vietnam, frozen basa fillets. So one of the things they did was doing participatory research offshore, but also they engaged the public in emphasizing the importance of local small-scale fishery and why it's important for the local economy and the fact that it's fresher, tastier fish. And this was done by just a graduate student working with a local institution that they established called POPA. We'll see what kind of lasting success that might have. The second is capacity development. I take you to Brazil, which is just next door. This is a Paraty project where my university was working with 2 other universities in Brazil. And basically we're working with small scale fishers and indoor tourism operators. The issue here is how to get them up to speed to negotiate with government on fishery regulations, but specifically about marine protected area regulations. Our postdoc, Anna Carolina, working with Prateep, knows all about these areas. She was worked in this area. In fact, we have a paper with Martin Bavink from Netherlands looking at case studies. So here the idea is not to lecture at fishers, but to guide them and to get them up to speed. Like the terminology government people use is not transparent to fishers. So you have to talk about what these terms are and what the issues are, and then you let the locals figure out how to tackle it. In the local association, this person was the key person who was the leader, and you know, like he knew as much as the university people about the issues, and he helped organize these workshops where people taught one another and they helped one another figure out what the changes were and how to go about it. The third example is scenario planning. This one I'm not going to go into detail, but what you can do is you can model the small-scale fishery, and you can express the results as narratives like stories, or you can use it as artistic expressions. The case comes from Doe and colleagues based in near Mombasa, Kenya, and they generated 4 scenarios. Remember, this is resilience, so it's future oriented. They chose to use artistic representations. A is more or less the fishery that's now. B is a more aggressive fishery, more boats, beach seines, more population. C is investing in tourism. Again, more boats, but also more tourism. But of course, having the hotel, that means you've lost your beach. And D is going high tech. Offshore in Mombasa means these bigger boats, although not very big by most standards, and aquaculture. So what you can do here is you can generate these scenarios, and you can make stories, or you can make pictures, and you take it back to the community and you say, okay, what do you want? What is your preference? And then you work towards that. So that's future-oriented resilience. So moving to the conclusions. Reducing vulnerabilities, no question, is obviously good, but vulnerabilities do not stay constant. So what happens when you get to use new shocks, new stresses impacting the small-scale fishery? And these are mostly unpredictable changes. And all fisheries that I know of are constantly facing these new shocks and stresses. So that's when you start looking at resilience. So resilience complements vulnerability. They work together. And it's also essential for getting to viability. And resilience is a sum of these coping, adapting, and transformative capacity. As in the Mombasa example, maybe the transformative case here is aquaculture, big tourism, but less emphasis on the small-scale fishery itself. And if you specifically look at community resilience, again, it uses the basics, the ability to absorb these shocks and stresses, self-organize, learn and adapt. This is common to all of them, even though specific resilience factors are different in each community and specific circumstances are different, but these hold everywhere. So community resilience is about adapting to change and overcoming adversity. The key, of course, here is sustainable livelihoods to get to viability. If you don't have livelihoods, you don't have viability. So you have to do things that help viability, and livelihoods. If that means better fishing harbors, it means road connections to markets. That's what you got to do. It's not a stock issue. It's everything, including infrastructure and economics, local economics. And we need to ask, whose resilience? Is it the resilience of these large-scale fishers, container transportation? No, it's the resilience of our small-scale fishing communities. And the researcher and the practitioner has an important role in looking at practicing participatory methods. You want to, the fishing community shouldn't be the subject. It should be your co-investigator, your co-practitioner. Help the community to increase its own understanding through research, reflection, and learning. And finally, some thanks for photos and research collaboration. Many people, of course, including Prateep and project support. Thank you. That's all.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Fikret. Lots of case studies, lots of examples, but also deep dive into some of the concepts and theories, and a nice combination of both of them. We're still waiting to have questions from the audience who are on the YouTube. But by the time we receive questions, it might take a few minutes. I would just start by asking one particular question on whose resilience and the emphasis on whose resilience we should be focusing. If you look at that, one set of emphasis is on the social-ecological system, and fisheries being small-scale fisheries being social-ecological system, and at the same time, if we combine the question of whose resilience, one strand really goes into looking at the system resilience itself. How do we tackle the question about looking at system resilience versus various components of the system and their resilience, say for marginalized people as one component of it? So how do you articulate that system resilience versus specific components?
Yes, I got it, Prateep. Thanks. Yeah. Well, looking at the resilience of the overall system, what would that be? Global? Well, that's of interest to all of us, but our emphasis is the small-scale fishery. So I think what we have to do here is define the system as the fishing community, the small-scale fishery system. Whether it's a small local community-based area or a regional area. In the case of your Chilika Lagoon, you have to take a regional view, because looking at the resilience of each community, and there are 50-something communities, is not it's going to be too messy. So you look at Chilika wide, but in other cases, like the Parachi example, like the photo here is from that area, you have to look at it community by community. But yeah, looking at the system as a whole, well, Canadian maritime region, in other words, the Atlantic coast, is probably too big to be useful for our purposes. Yeah. Canadian Pacific, well, again, region, the whole region, small-scale fisheries do have common problems like interception offshore fisheries. So for some problems, you can look at the whole region, but for practical purposes, that's too big a region. So I think you define the system yourself for the problems in hand.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Fikret. So now we have questions flowing in. So the first question, Fikret, is from Muhammad Atik Asab Songlap. They're an undergraduate student from Sylhet Agricultural University in Bangladesh. And the question is, hi, Dr. Berkes. Time flies ages after ages, but the fishers' lives are stuck in moneylenders' net in Bangladesh. The government NGOs are trying a lot, but there is still no definite solution. So I don't know whether this is a question or, just something for you to reflect, and provide some.
Well, some of these bigger issues don't have definitive solutions. But I first went to Bangladesh in the 90s, mid and late 90s. There was a Ford Foundation project looking at community organization, community co-ops, and empowering the co-ops to buy or sublet these sites to cut out the middlemen. And that seemed to be working reasonably well. I don't know if the program is still on. It had a second component, which was about women's co-ops in the same communities as sort of women's self-help groups, basically stocking fingerlings as a way of enhancing the local fishery. So the combination of, in the cases we looked at in Bangladesh, and we looked at about 7 different areas, it was actually working quite well. Enhancing the fishery through fingerlings, but also having the co-op trying to cut out, you can't cut out all the middlemen because the big money lenders still control the main sites, but you can reduce the number of steps by which you keep losing resource rent. One of the problems in that case was literacy level was so low that there often was only one literate person in the co-op who controlled money, and you know what happens when that comes up, when that happens. When I went back to Bangladesh in 2010s, the literacy rate had actually gone up. So the first question I asked in the tea room was, how many people can read and write? And about a quarter of the fishers raised their hands. So part of the problem is education in the case of Bangladesh, and having an informed body of fishers that can fight for their rights.
Thanks, Fikret. The second question is from Erwin Prayogi, and they identify themselves as early career researcher from Kutai Kartanegara University in Indonesia, and I know Erwin works in the Kalimantan area. Dear Dr. Berkes, sometimes SSF is driven by political things from the outside. Their position could be up and down, depends on the situation. How resilience can help maintain these fluctuations or respond to these fluctuations?
Yeah, I've not been to Kalimantan, but in our project in Bali, which is part of Indonesia, the overall political regime had a huge impact on whether the local fishers could solve their own problems. So I guess resilience here would be having good local institutions who can take advantage of windows of opportunity. These are windows of opportunity. When change occurs, sometimes there's a chance to make changes in the system, and this has happened in Chile as well. When the dictator died, there was this window of opportunity where new regulations were put in to regulate local inshore fisheries, and it really did work. So you can't do much about the overall politics, but you can be ready to take advantage of these chance events, these windows of opportunity, which is actually one of the resilience factors itself. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There is another question related to your portion of the talk with regards to Bangladesh. Ruel Mia. Ruel is a graduate student in University of Waterloo in Canada, works extensively in Bangladesh and other places. So Ruel is asking, I wondered if a fishing community is bound to money lenders year-round for credit support to cope with or adjust to different uncertainties, such as natural disasters. How can we describe them? Are they vulnerable or resilient?
I'm not sure what the question is, though.
So I think there are two parts to this question. One is the relationship between fishers and the money lenders. Yeah. Does it contribute to their vulnerability or resilience? So probably Ruel is indicating that it might be contributing to their resilience because of the timely access to funds, but at the same time it is also making them vulnerable. So
yeah. Well, I mean, Bangladesh fishers are very vulnerable, most vulnerable I've seen anywhere. In Prateep's case, in fact, there were some fish traders who were basically on the side of the fishers, but in the case of Bangladesh, the money lenders are clearly not on the side of the fishers. But Bangladesh has another important factor. It also has the most amazing NGOs. And in the few success stories we have involve NGOs as helping the fishers, but also helping get credit. So the way to break the money lender monopoly is basically to be informed, to be knowledgeable, as I mentioned in the earlier question, but also having access to funds. Quite often money lenders are there because the system creates them. So like if one money lender died, the system doesn't collapse, another money lender takes his place. So the only way to replace them is by fishers having access to credit and being able to buy the fishing rights. Mm-hmm. If that zamindari type system continues in Bangladesh.
Yeah, and of course, Bangladesh's reputation with regards to microcredit is something.
Yeah, exactly. So that's the big debate. Like microcredit is great for household level improvement, but does it work at the community and regional and national level? And that is a big question. The famous Grameen Bank and all that. No doubt it works at the household level. Mm-hmm. Like a $10, whatever 5,000 taka credit makes a big difference. But does it make enough of a difference to bring up that whole small scale fishery? I haven't seen that happen.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I'm going to take a question from Faluke Ariola. And Faluke is from Nigeria and works with one of our partners, partner institutions there. Thank you, Dr. Berkes. I took loads of notes. How do you improve the ability of institutions to influence things? For instance, where you have leaderships that are not acknowledgeable and or committed to SSF?
Sorry, I'm not clear about the question.
How do you improve the ability of institutions to influence things, for instance, where you have leaderships that are not knowledgeable and committed to SSF? So the conflict between institutions and leaderships within that. Yes.
Okay, yeah. Well, if you have democratic institutions, you can vote them out. If you don't have democratic institutions, I'm not sure. I guess social pressure through elders, and I mean knowledgeable elders, influential elders, basically social pressure. I mean, these things happen in most developing countries. Well, I mean, in most countries, including Canada, you can use social pressure to bring about change. And it's not just about voting and regulations. And so I would say use traditional African institutions like traditional leadership and the role of elders. Most villagers in West Africa, for example, have elders councils. Like most villages in India have panchayats, which are often elders councils. So these are not the institutions that make decisions directly on the fishery, but these are institutions that have weight to make and influence changes.
I know we are getting to the time, but we have 3 more questions left. Maybe we can quickly read that out to you, Fikret. The first one is Bhavishya Kania. Bhavishya is from Nepal, but he studies in Waterloo, Canada. Thank you, Professor Berkes. What is the important? Why it is important to understand social ecological tipping points for building resilience?
Why is it important to understand
social ecological tipping points for building resilience? Social ecological tipping points.
Tipping points. Well, because that's when the whole system changes. So going back to the Chilika Lagoon, do ask Prateep, is it close to the tipping point or has it already exceeded the tipping point? It doesn't happen all of a sudden, but in this particular case, but in many other cases, the tipping point is quite obvious. And we have a case from Vietnamese inshore fisheries where you have the capture fishery goes on and on and on, and bang, all of a sudden it's an aquaculture fishery. So a whole bunch of people lose livelihoods. In the case of, well, not every tipping point is a bad one, but in many cases of tipping points, you lose livelihoods, you lose viability of the small-scale fishery, if that's what we want.
Okay. Quickly, the 2 more questions. The next one is from Soumitra Chaudhary, and I think Soumitra is from Bangladesh, joining from. Thanks, Dr. Berkes. I think giving education and training will help small-scale fishers to get rid of the money lenders net. Most of the fishermen I have seen in Bangladesh are illiterate and frightened. The fear factor.
Again, I'm not clear about the question.
So yeah, how do you bring them out of their fear, and then lack of education as a factor contributing to their, marginalization in the hands of money lenders?
Yeah. Well, one thing that strikes me is that we have a lot of questions and comments from Bangladesh, and almost all of them are about money lenders. So this is a really important point in the case of Bangladesh.
Okay.
Probably not everywhere in the world, but I think it's an important point, probably in many places. Okay, I talked about literacy campaigns, education, etc. But let me refer back to the last part of my talk, which is about participatory research, participatory development, etc. All these systems that they've used in agriculture. So it's not just an issue of formal education, but it's practitioners, NGOs, as well as universities, researchers, working with communities and educating them, but also helping them understand and deal with their own issues. If you make the fishermen dependent on you, that's not very useful. If you make the fishermen help understand what the issues are and what can be done about it, then that's more useful.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so we'll end with this as the last question from Idrisu Amadou from Ghana. How do we build community resilience to future shocks when political capital is unequal and affects the distribution of fishing inputs?
Yeah, okay, well, good to end on a big question. Resource access to markets, these are political questions. Conflicts between different sectors, different user groups, these are political questions. So resilience does not replace political action. Again, I refer to the to Prateep's Chilika case. You have to campaign politically, you have to fight politically, and you have to fight for your rights. It's not going to happen automatically, and there's no resilience substitute for political action, and it's an ongoing political struggle right through, and that goes for money lenders, it goes for blue economy issues, and I hope this V2V is a strong voice and a close partner to TBTI, and we have to work on this politically as well as practitioners and scholars, because the issues are big and they're global. The small-scale fisheries in Canada share much the same problems with those in Africa, those in Japan, those in Indonesia. And it's TBTI, too big to ignore. We're talking about a sector that harvests more than half of the fish consumed by people. And it involves millions and millions of livelihoods and their families. You know, like 500,000 in that Chilika alone. So these are big issues, and it's worth fighting for. Thank you.
If I may request Seville to bring up the poster for our next month's webinar. In the meantime, I want to extend a heartfelt thanks to Fikret for making time and coming and talking to us on another aspects of vulnerability to viability that is so core to our partnership here. And thanks to the audience who have joined from different places of the world, and the wonderful questions and engaging on an important topic today, which is, you know, how resilience links to vulnerability and viability, and what are some of the important lessons for transitioning from one V to the other V. Thank you once again, Fikret, for that wonderful talk. So I would like to invite all of you to our next month's webinar talk by Milena Arias Scriber. And Milena is going to talk about the world's need for the ocean we share, concepts for the viability of small-scale fisheries. And we will also, send this information, through our network, but also be available on our website. Please join us next month on the last Friday, which is the 27th May. And thanks once again to Fikret and everybody that joined and made this a really wonderful learning experience for all of us. Thank you. Thanks once again. Bye-bye.